3 years from now, if you had to place a bet, it doesn't have to be a large bet, but if you just had to take a position in what things might look like with respect to free speech, what picture would you paint in as much or in as little detail as you would like?
I think that in 3 years, the largest players in whatever platforms emerge, metaverse or other platforms, are going to be under a lot of pressure to do the kind of content moderation and regulation of speech and conduct that happened in Web 2.0. And it's not just going to be speech, it's going to be stuff you do. Because if the metaverse turns out to work really well, you're not just going to talk to people there, right? In theory, everything you're doing on Twitter is talking, right? You're writing, so you're speaking. But if you were in a fully immersive experience, you can also do stuff. You can play games, you can punch people virtually, you can kiss them virtually. Every other human activity, presumably, you can engage in virtually. That's conduct. It's not just talking. And so it's not even clear that free speech would be the normal model to apply to it. I mean, you can imagine someone saying, well, that's all speech because it's virtual. And maybe someone would think that. That might turn out to be right. But it actually will, I think, feel a lot more like conduct. I think already some of the virtual platforms that people use on the metaverse feel a lot more like doing stuff than they do like saying stuff. So I think there'll be huge pressure for the companies in the first instance to regulate the stuff that people can do and say. And if the companies don't do it, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on the government to do it. And so I think that especially if the metaverse in 3 years is good enough that people are spending a reasonable amount of time doing stuff there, it will have to be subject to pretty substantial internal private regulation. And given that, I think that the kind of free speech from the government that people want may continue to exist, but I don't think people are going to be able to do whatever they want in every subpart of the metaverse. I think there will be parts where it's do whatever you want, first-person shooter against the world, do whatever you want to anybody. There'll be places to go and do that. But I think if you want the vast majority of people to spend a lot of time in a space, it has to be pretty orderly. And it would be lovely if human beings could order themselves spontaneously, but we don't have a lot of evidence that they've ever managed to do that in the past. And the idea that they're going to do that in the next 3 years in the metaverse seems pretty implausible to me.
Yeah, we have a very strong Lord of the Flies history behind us. I'm not sure that human nature will turn on a dime and will turn into the angels of our better nature immediately. One can hope, one can hope.
It'd be nice.
Any other, I don't want to call them predictions, speculations for what we may also see 3 years from now? I mean, it seems to me, if I had to bet, I think there's going to be a strong centralized nature to what many would hope would be decentralized metaverses or a metaverse. I simply think the discovery process, the interoperability issues, and so on may be so thorny. Also, frankly, the policing or moderating of conduct will become such a priority for so many players that for those and other reasons, many will choose centralized companies or organizations rather than decentralized options. That seems inevitable to me. Even within Web3, if you think about a lot of what dictates behavior, you find centralized tastemakers. Why? Because for each individual to have the responsibility to sort through the noise, to read the code, to look at the smart contracts, to audit, to do all of these things themselves is simply not feasible unless you have infinite time on your hands and the capabilities. So I do think I'm fascinated by decentralization and have invested very heavily in Web3 and related technologies. But nonetheless, I do think people crave centralized sort of authority and standards on some level. At least enough people do that will have strong centralized players. But that's just my speculation. Anything else you see just over the next, say, 3 years that you would expect to see?
Yeah, there is one other thing that I think will be really fascinating and important. When we think about what the next phase of Web 3.0 will look like, we probably still don't fully understand what the AR, VR interplay is going to be. right? There's still people who say it's all going to be VR, it's mostly going to be VR, and other people say no, it's going to be mostly be AR. And I don't, that's a really fascinating and hard debate. My guess is it's going to be something we haven't exactly figured out what it's going to look like yet. But let's assume for a moment that a substantial part of this is augmented reality, so that it's not just that we live all of our lives in this, to me, dystopian world where we spend 8 or 10 hours a day with a headset over our eyes, in a darkened room. We're still going to have a lot of this technology, but it's probably going to go with us in some mechanism when we go out into the world. So now what that does is it makes it really hard to work out what it means to be regulated and what it means to be free when you're interacting in real life with other people and simultaneously interacting with those same people or with other people in some kind of virtual reality or augmented reality. So the idea is you and I are having this conversation right now, and we're connected by the internet, and we're connected by video, and we're connected by audio, and we're creating something. In some sense, we're already doing an augmented reality form of interaction. But if you add in a whole bunch of other layers and imagine that we're walking down the street having a conversation on multiple levels simultaneously, which is not so impossible to imagine, since after all, you see people all the time walking down the street talking to each other, both of them on their phones, which is just a crude version of what presumably we'll be doing in some future moment. So in that environment, the really big challenge that I see coming, and I'm really only just starting to get a sense of this now, and I haven't said this anywhere before, is that the idea that you have one set of rights and obligations to the person you're talking to in real life, and another set of rules and obligations to the person you're engaged with in augmented reality at the same moment, it's not going to work. It's not going to work to have two different regulatory regimes involving the two of us at the same time. And if the government regulates what we can do to each other in real life, and a private company regulates what we can do to each other in this AR, VR kind of space simultaneously, it's going to get really messy and really confusing. What if you insult me or I insult you in some way that we would not be allowed to do on the virtual engagement, but that we're perfectly permitted to do interpersonally? Or flip it the other way. What if you punch me in augmented reality or virtual reality, which you wouldn't be legally allowed to do on the street because the cops would arrest you, but I feel just as punched, or maybe not just as punched, but very punched in some dimension? If we really get, so my takeaway here is this, if we really get some complex mixed AR, VR mix, it's not sustainable to have two totally disparate regulatory regimes, one coming from the government and one coming from the private companies. And so this is a little bit in tension with what I said before. What I was saying before was that my base case is that we are going to have mostly private regulation in these virtual spaces and continue to have mostly government regulation in real life. What I'm saying now is if we get this kind of really complexly mixed AR, VR thing, that equilibrium will not be sustainable. We'll have to move towards some much more unified, integrated kind of regulatory regime. And that's going to be fascinating, and it's going to be really extremely, extremely complicated.
My, oh my, the adventures ahead.